Brilliant, thanks, Andy. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm the Global Biodiversity Policy Coordinator here at BirdLife International. BirdLife International is a global partnership of conservation organisations that strives to conserve birds, their habitats and global biodiversity, working with people towards sustainability in the use of natural resources. Together, we're over 100 BirdLife partners worldwide and growing. I'm going to give you a whistle-stop introduction to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework discussions. So, the Convention on Biological Diversity is a multilateral environmental agreement that promotes nature alongside human well-being. It was established in 1992. It covers all ecosystems, species, and genetic resources, and its objectives of the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from commercial and other use of genetic resources. It aims to foster biodiversity conservation alongside sustainable development with a 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. There are 196 parties to the CBD, including 195 states and the EU. The Conference of the Parties, the COP, is the main decision-making body. A COP meeting is open to all parties to the CBD. Non-parties such as NGOs, UN agencies, and other intergovernmental organisations can also participate as observers. The COP discussions are assisted by two subsidiary bodies, SBSTA, which provides scientific, technical, and technological advice, and SBI, which advises on implementation. The COP will meet this year to agree the next strategic framework to build on that contained within the current strategic framework and its Key Biodiversity Targets. This framework is currently known as the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So by way of an overview, the 2011 to 2020 strategic plan is structured into 5 strategic goals, which contain a total of 20 concrete targets, the so-called Key Biodiversity Targets. The strategic goals address the following. Under A, the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity across government and society. Goal B focuses on associated targets to reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity and to promote sustainable use. The focus of Goal C is to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystem species and genetic diversity. Goal D looks to enhance the benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services, and Goal E's focus is to enhance implementation through participatory planning, knowledge, management, and capacity building. So as you can see, a lot packed into it. The CBD Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, a report produced on the basis of national reporting from the parties to the CBD, analysed global progress towards the Key targets. It showed that collectively the world has failed to meet the Key biodiversity targets, though progress has been made in some areas, and findings included that conservation actions have averted extinction, that the rate of deforestation has slowed by 1/3 in the last decade, and there has been a considerable expansion of protected areas. Key factors contributing, however, to this failure include the lack of a clear implementation pathway and insufficient financial resource mobilisation to fill the biodiversity finance gap. This analysis is further supported in BirdLife's Birds and Biodiversity Targets report, which outlines the shortfalls of each of the targets, whilst also bringing a message of hope to the world, using bird conservation successes to show that solutions exist for the problems facing the biosphere, and that nature can recover swiftly when these are enacted. The report uses bird case studies to demonstrate where policies and actions are having success, but also where they continue to fail. The report aims to dispel the idea that the governments failed because the targets were unachievable, outlining the actions needed to plot a course where, by 2050, nature and humanity can live in harmony. So you can see in this figure that each of the goals and targets have been assigned a score dependent on how close we were to meeting the targets. And significantly, you can see bird data shows us that none of the targets were fully met, and there was only the best that we could hope for was some progress, but the target wasn't met, and some, of course, we moved away from the target. So now we've been And now we've seen where we've come from, I'm going to turn to where we're going to in the process to develop the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework has been built as a new plan to save life on Earth. COP15 will adopt the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and it will outline what countries need to do individually and collectively in the next decade and beyond to set humanity on a course for achieving the CBD's overall vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. The preparatory process for agreement of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework was kicked off at COP14 in Egypt in 2018. Since then, a series of discussions have taken place through the subsidiary bodies, regional and thematic consultations, and the specially established open-ended working group. These have discussed the scope and content of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, reviewed a zero draft of the proposed framework, and discussed mechanisms for the implementation of the framework. As you'll appreciate, the time frame has shifted due to the pandemic, and meeting processes and dates remain uncertain. The next meetings in the schedule will be Substat 24 and SBI 3, followed by the third and final open-ended working group, leading us to COP15 in October 2021 in Kunming, China, so almost a year later than originally scheduled. The draft post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is built on the theory of change represented in the figure shown here, and this builds on the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020 and sets out an ambitious plan to implement broad-based action to bring about a transformation in society's relationship with biodiversity and to ensure that by 2050 the shared vision of living in harmony with nature is fulfilled. The framework aims to galvanise urgent and transformative action by governments and all of society, including Indigenous peoples and local communities, civil society and businesses, to achieve the outcomes it sets out in its vision, mission, goals and targets, and thereby contribute to the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity and other biodiversity-related multilateral agreements, processes and instruments. So the framework's theory of change assumes that transformative actions are taken to put in place tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming, reduce the threats to biodiversity, and ensure that biodiversity is used sustainably in order to meet people's needs, and that these actions are supported by enabling conditions and adequate means of implementation, including financial resources, capacity, and technology. The current draft framework has 4 long-term goals to 2050, underpinned by 8 milestones to 2030. The framework has 20 action-oriented targets for 2030, which, if achieved, will contribute to the 2030 milestones and the outcome-oriented goals for 2050. The targets are split into those aimed at reducing threats to biodiversity, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, alongside targets on tools and solutions for implementing and mainstreaming to reflect the outlined theory of change. The focus of our discussion today are on the elements in which key biodiversity areas have an important role. For positions on aspects outside this current discussion, you can find BirdLife International's positions as well as joint positions developed with our partner NGOs at birdlife.org/post2020, and there's a link here on the slide. For more details on the process, you should also visit the CBD's dedicated website, which there is also a link here in this slide. So finally, before I pass back to Andy, a few ideas on how you can engage in the process, some of which are more appropriate for observers on the call. The first of these is to develop and or input to positions on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework through mechanisms such as the KBA Committee and help formulate policy positions and responses to GBF drafts and documents. Secondly, you can advocate to your national focal points, some of who are on the call now. Make contact with your country's primary national focal point. Each party has an official representative for each CBD process. There's a link here in the slide which will provide you with a list of your relevant contacts, and share with them policy positions you support. If your country holds national stakeholder consultations, then you can join them and input in those forums. Thirdly, talk to your national media. If you have links to national television, radio or print news outlets or online channels, Pass on your own case studies and key messages to get and bring focus to your positions in the media. You should also look to attend CBD public and informal sessions. The CBD and other stakeholders hold public briefing webinars on various aspects of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This will help you to keep updated on and, when possible, input to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the negotiations process. Also, look for opportunities to join observer or party delegations to the CBD meetings, including Substes, BI, the Open-Ended Working Group session, and the COP. You can promote your communication of your positions to support and amplify the communications and messages you support by sharing them through your own communication channels, for example, through Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and share your content to showcase and promote your work relevant to the CBD process and its implementation on the ground. You can help raise awareness and build momentum towards COP15 using the hashtags for nature and hashtag for nature and hashtag COP15, which have been adopted by the CBD Biodiversity Flotilla for use by all parties and partners and stakeholders involved and inputting to the COP15 process. So that is all I have to say in this brief introduction, and I'll pass back to Andy. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please add them into the chat and I'll do my best to answer them.
Thank you very much, Amy. And we'll now move on to a presentation by Daniel Marnowick. Yes, if you have questions, please save them up for the end. We'll have a discussion section at the end. Daniel Marnowick is the chair of the KBA Community and runs the community listserv and Facebook site. So if those of you who are not part of that listserv or Facebook site want to be involved and engaged, then you can also email him. We'll share these presentations at the end of this presentation on the emails that we sent out so that you have copies and access to the links that are in the presentations. Okay, Daniel, thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and welcome everyone. As Andy mentioned, I'm chair of the KBA Community, which is a structure under the KBA Committee set up to facilitate discussion and engagement among the broader community of practice when it comes to KBAs, from proposing data collection through to the conservation of these sites. There are community representatives across the different regions, and these community reps work with the national coordination groups and governments to promote KBAs. So my presentation is to give you a background on key biodiversity areas, what their origins are, and how they are important for national, regional, and global prerogatives when it comes to conservation, and particularly area-based conservation. Just want to change screens, there we go. But we have to start at the beginning and talk to the problem statement, and this is really about biodiversity in crisis. And biodiversity loss is occurring at an alarming rate across the world's terrestrial, freshwater, and marine environments, and many species and ecosystems are at risk of being lost forever. This is a crisis in its own right, but also has significant negative consequences for human well-being through the loss of ecosystem services such as pollination, fisheries, freshwater, and cultural heritage. So we need an ambitious and collective global response, which has high impacts and which spans across various sectors. To be effective, we need to invest in the right places to ensure that we're getting value for our conservation investments. And there are a number of global standards and guidelines and frameworks that can assist us to focus our investments. And starting with the Iucn Red List of Threatened Species, which identifies species that are most at risk of extinction, based on declining population trends, geographic concentration, and or small population size. These are then ranked in 3 threatened categories, namely vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. If we move beyond critically endangered, we're then looking at species being extinct in the wild or extinct in the wild and captive populations. So we don't want to get to that point. So we need to invest our resources in these threat categories to reverse the threat to that species. Ecosystems are equally at risk of collapse. And since 1950, humans have changed ecosystems at a faster rate than in any other period in history. Unlike species, ecosystems do not disappear, but they are transformed and replaced by different ecosystems with different species, interactions, and ecological processes. So an ecosystem is considered collapsed when its characteristic native species and other defining features are lost, or when species that perform key ecological roles are greatly reduced in abundance and are no longer able to maintain those functions. So there's an urgent need to address this biodiversity crisis, and safeguarding habitats is one of the most effective conservation strategies available to us. But this depends on knowing which areas in the world contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity so that we can safeguard those sites. So it's about knowing where to invest, where we're going to get the most bang for our buck. And this was recognized by the CBD, which in Iucn Target 11 calls for the conservation of areas of particular importance for biodiversity. So there are a number of components to Target 11. There's a percentage component, so it calls for covering 16 and 10% respectively of land using protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. But something that wasn't paid particular attention to was this areas of particular importance for biodiversity. And this despite the fact that there were already many different approaches to identifying important areas for biodiversity. And this was at various scales. You had hotspots and ecoregions, which were regional priorities. But most of these really looked at the site scale and identifying the most important sites. And BirdLife International's Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas program, or IBA program, really led the way over the last few decades in terms of identifying the most important places for birds and associated habitats. And a number of other approaches for other taxa were then developed based on that model. However, we got to a point where we had so many of these for various taxa and at different scales that it became quite confusing for decision makers. And so at the World Conservation Congress in Bangkok in 2004, Iucn members recognized the need for a unifying framework for identifying the most important sites across all biodiversity. And this was specifically referenced in Resolution 3.013, which requested a worldwide consultative process to agree a methodology to enable countries to identify key biodiversity areas, drawing on data from the Iucn Red List of Threatened Species and other data sets, and building on these existing approaches I mentioned earlier. Following that was an extensive global consultation process over many years involving Iucn members, other conservation organizations, academia, governments, donors, and the private sector. And after this lengthy consultation, the conservation community rallied around a common approach to identifying sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. And these are key biodiversity areas, which provides an umbrella framework designed to harmonize these existing approaches to the identification of important sites across taxa and ecosystems. So the Iucn developed a global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas, and this was formally adopted by the Iucn Council and launched alongside the KBA partnership at the World Conservation Congress in Hawaii in 2016. And today the KBA partnership consists of 13 of the world's leading conservation organizations, which through their extensive global networks have committed to identify, map, monitor, and conserve KBAs around the world, of which we have over 16,000 today. So in short, KBAs are defined as sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. And the criteria are applicable across the marine, freshwater, terrestrial, and subterranean systems. We unfortunately can't go into all the criteria, but just a snapshot overview. Most previous approaches to identifying important sites have been species-based, but the KBA standard goes beyond that and includes both species and ecosystem-based criteria. And genetic diversity is also addressed under some of these species-based criteria. But collectively, the criteria aim to capture the various ways in which a site can be important for the global persistence of biodiversity, because it holds threatened or geographically restricted biodiversity, has outstanding ecological integrity, maintains important biological processes, or is shown to be highly irreplaceable through quantitative analysis. There are 11 criteria which are grouped under these 5 high-level criteria you see, A through to E. Once KBAs have been proposed and accepted by the KBA Secretariat, they're then loaded onto the World Database for Key Biodiversity Areas. And this is open access to the public, where they are able to view where these KBAs are located, what has triggered that KBA, so what are the important biodiversity elements at the site, how big it is, how well protected it is, and what the key threats are to that site. So why are KBAs important for national governments, and how does it help meet national prerogatives? Well, governments can use this information to support conservation priority setting through the strategic expansion of protected area networks and the implementation of international environmental agreements, including commitments to expand protected area coverage under the CBD Iucn Target 11 and commitments to prevent species extinction under Iucn Target 12. Conserving KBAs is essential also to help countries meet their sustainable development goals, and protected area coverage of KBAs is an official indicator for 3 of the targets under Target 14 and 15. This is just to showcase one of the countries that has recently undertaken an extensive KBA assessment in Mozambique, where they identified 29 KBAs for the country, spanning marine and terrestrial sites. And to date, this is one of the most comprehensive national assessments undertaken yet. And it provides an opportunity to showcase this effort amongst the global community. And we are in fact planning to have a webinar to showcase this to the broader KBA community. Conservation funding agencies such as the Global Environmental Facility and Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund use this information to guide investments in conservation. Both GEF and CEPF are founding members of the KBA partnership. And new protected areas established with GEF support must be globally significant as defined by the KBA standard. In other words, if GEF's going to invest in protected area expansion, they want that to be in KBAs. The private sector also uses KBAs. Information on KBAs is channeled to international financing agencies such as the International Finance Corporation. And these agencies use this information in their safeguard policies and investment decisions, providing strong incentives to companies seeking international financing to avoid environmentally destructive impacts in these areas. And KBAs are now recognized by the IFC and the Equator Principles as likely critical habitat. Information on KBAs is also channeled to large natural resource-based companies and corporations through the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, or IBAT, so that they can take this information into account early in the project exploration and development phase and avoid negative impacts on KBAs where possible. Guidelines on how businesses can engage with KBAs have been developed to help direct business engagement when they are considering developing in or near KBAs to minimize their impact on those sites. This map just illustrates the global interest in KBAs. So the green and red countries are countries that have an interest and are starting to set up national processes for KBA identification, or have set up national coordination groups, which is the grass level national group that oversees the work in that country, because KBA identification is really a bottom-up approach. And these national coordination groups consist of national taxon experts, data holders, and conservation practitioners. Then lastly, it's just to highlight a large campaign, which you are all aware of, the 30 by 30 for Nature campaign. This is a conservation community pushing to increase the percentage targets currently in target 11, but to increase that to 30% protection by 2030 using protected areas and OECMs. So this would be setting another percentage target. And what you want to avoid here, again, is the focus being on the target rather than implementing this in the right places. And KBAs can help guide where this 30% is placed. And if used, will be better to ensure that key populations or portions of ecosystems are protected. So that is the end of my portion of the presentation. I'm going to hand back to Andy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Now I'm going to dive into looking specifically at the language that we are proposing can be integrated in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and where we're asking you to help us engage with the CBD process so that we can try and push this language because of your interests within KBAs. So one of the things we've done recently is we've reviewed all of the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans of every country that have submitted one to the CBD, and all the latest reports, either Report 5s, Report 6s, and in a couple of cases, Report 4s, which were the latest report from the countries. And one of the encouraging things that we see is that there's a growing interest and use of key biodiversity areas in the NBSAPs and NBSAP reports, particularly since the publication of the KBA Global Standard in 2016. There's been quite a jump in the reference to key biodiversity areas. And currently, about 30% of NBSAPs reference key biodiversity areas, but only about 14% of countries have specific targets yet for key biodiversity areas. And clearly, this needs to grow. The Convention of Biological Diversity is putting together draft language around the 4 main goals that Amy mentioned, and Goal A is probably the most relevant to key biodiversity areas, and that's currently phrased in this format: the connectivity and integrity of natural ecosystems is increased by at least a certain percentage, supporting healthy and resilient populations of all species while reducing the number of species that are threatened by X%. And maintaining genetic diversity. And under these goals, there are 20 targets. Targets 1, 2, and 13 are the most relevant for KBA, so I'll focus on those ones. So the current language for target 1, which is about spatial planning and ecosystem conservation, is that by 2030, and there's a suggested 50% of land and sea areas globally are under spatial planning, addressing land-sea use change, retaining most of the existing intact and wilderness areas, and allowing a restoration of a certain percentage yet to be decided of degraded freshwater, marine, and terrestrial natural ecosystems and connectivity among them. As a KBA partnership has been thinking how we could add KBA language to this, because clearly we want all of these, the spatial planning to be around key biodiversity areas, and the intact and wilderness areas can be partially identified by criterion sea sites, and also other areas of importance for intact ecosystems. And what we're suggesting is that as part of the rationale for this target, that there's mention of a comprehensive national assessments of key biodiversity areas as part of the spatial planning, and incorporation of the key biodiversity areas in national spatial planning, because that will ensure that spatial plans are built around globally important sites. So if you are a CBD representative on this webinar, we'd ask you if you could be pushing some of this type of language as part of the rationale for this target. Independently, there's been a motion that was passed by the Iucn as part of the World Conservation Congress of 2020. And this was about motion, there was a motion on spatial planning in particular, which is clearly relevant to this target. It calls upon governments at all levels to develop or update spatially explicit conservation plans to incorporate sites and areas of importance for the global persistence of biodiversity across multiple taxa and ecosystems, brackets KBAs, along with the connectivity required to ensure biodiversity persistence, and to use these to inform plans to expand networks of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. And secondly, calls upon governments to incorporate these plans into their national biodiversity strategies and action plans and integrate them through cross-sectoral planning across government and non-governmental institutions, using them prior to and at all stages of national land and sea use planning to avoid or otherwise minimize negative impacts on biodiversity. There's also some calls on the conservation community and donors and other groups as part of that motion. So I would encourage you to go and look at the full motion at that link when we circulate it. This motion was voted on by the Iucn partners, and it got 100% support from government institutions and 99% support from all the other partners, the non-governmental institutions, with a total of 736 people voting for it. We've also, in that assessment of national biodiversity strategy and action plans, we've also assessed how spatial planning is incorporated within those plans and within the reports. So here in these graphs, the top one, at the most basic evidence of spatial planning is to have a map of your protected areas, and quite a lot of the reports in particular show maps of their protected areas. But then if you start to look at, are there maps of other sites, which includes key biodiversity areas, but can also included important bird and biodiversity areas, included Alliance for Zero Extinction sites and other sites of importance. And then we looked at the NBSAPs and NBSAP reports that had also looked at specific biodiversity patterns. So that was looking at distributions of species across the country, which could be used for spatial planning and inputs into more detailed spatial planning. In the types of spatial plans, for example, that South Africa has been able to do in their country, where they've pulled all of their biodiversity data together and looked at that spatial planning. And we also looked at how do those change over time. So if we looked at the fourth reports, fifth reports, and sixth reports, and the average dates are up there on that bottom map, you can see that for each of these types of spatial component, there's been increases over time in the NBSAPs and NBSAP reports. And there's an increasing use of the UN biolabs, which contains the KBA data layer, as well as many other data layers that governments can have access to and do analyses from. The second target is specifically about protection of sites, and the current language for that target is that by 2030, we protect and conserve through well-connected and effective system of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, OECMs, at least 30% of the planet, with a focus on areas of particular importance for biodiversity. What the KBA partnership would like to propose is a slight reversal of the order of some of those components of this target. Because of the issues that were faced with the previous Aichi target 17 and the emphasis put on the percentage, we feel that it's important to put the emphasis at the beginning on areas of importance for biodiversity, and we feel that key biodiversity areas are now becoming recognized as the standard for identifying areas of importance for biodiversity, so they should be specifically mentioned in the target. And that this type of language here, where the bold is the revised language we're proposing, so that by 2030, effectively conserve key biodiversity areas and other sites of particular importance for biodiversity through well-connected, equitably managed protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, covering at least 30% of the land, sea, and freshwater. So people may not necessarily agree with the exact wording of this target, but the ideas particularly are to have the important areas up front and that key biodiversity areas are specifically mentioned. Target 13 is about mainstreaming biodiversity in government, and the current language is that by 2030, we'd integrate biodiversity values into policies, regulations, planning, development processes, poverty reduction strategies, and accounts at all levels, ensuring that biodiversity values are mainstreamed across all sectors and integrated into the assessments of environmental impacts. We propose not that we change any of this language specifically, but that there is rationale and the guidance that goes with this target, that they're specifically linking the target 1, which is about spatial planning, to target 13, because we see that the spatial plans are a very useful tool for governments to help mainstream biodiversity into government. Once you have a map showing your most important areas that you're wanting to conserve, then you can share that with other sectors, such as the agricultural sector when they're planning agricultural expansion, urban sector for urban expansion, businesses who are wanting to develop concessions in different places, so that as a whole, a country can aim to try and minimize the negative impacts on biodiversity. Suggesting is that spatially explicit plans for biodiversity, as endorsed by the governments and the conservation community, developed under Target 1, provide one such tool that can be used to mainstream biodiversity conservation across sectors, and that this language is put in with the rationale so that it tries to link Target 1 and Target 13, so that they Target 13 logically follows on from Target 1. In addition to the targets, there's a set of indicators being proposed at the moment. And some of the indicators that we would like to see in the post-2020 process, I will list now. There's an existing indicator for the Sustainable Development Goals, 14.5, 15.1, 15.4, and Iucn Target 11, which is the coverage of KBAs by protected areas. It's a proportion of KBAs that are covered by protected areas. And as you can see from this figure, that's been increasing over the years. It's currently about 46%. But additional indicators that we think could be included, for Target 1, the percentage of spatial plans utilizing information on key biodiversity areas could be relatively easily collected and would then ensure that key biodiversity areas are part of those spatial plans. Target 2, we would want to keep the average proportion of KBAs covered by protected areas, which is the existing indicator, but also add in a proportion of KBAs in favorable condition as a second indicator of that, because it's not just an issue of creating a protected area over a KBA. If that protected area is not effectively managed, then protected areas can degrade. And what's important is that the KBA and the protected area are in favorable condition. On Target 13, we would suggest that the proportion of national biodiversity policies and plans that incorporate national spatial assessments of KBAs and other areas of importance for biodiversity could also be monitored as an indicator. So governments are engaging with the CBD process, and what we're asking here is that those of you on this call can also help promote KBA language within each of your countries. And some of the ideas, Amy gave some ideas in her presentation. Some additional ideas here is looking to make interventions that promote KBA, the use of KBAs in government and in the CBD process in both the targets and indicators as suggested in this presentation. I'm happy to work with anyone to help craft suggested language. If you're wanting to submit something to the CBD and are looking for a specific language, I'm always open and you can contact me. lobbying donors with in-country requests to support to meet national KBA related goals. Most of the major donors now are willing to fund KBAs, but always request that it comes as a national request from the country. And so if you work with your donor missions in country, then they will be supportive of funding KBAs and their conservation. And then also working to showcase what your work on KBAs in your NBSAP reports and moving more KBAs into specific targets in the NBSAPs as well. We have a website, www.keybiodiversityareas.org, where you can find out more information about key biodiversity areas and particularly how governments can engage as well. There's a section on that. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the KBA Community, and Daniel as chair of the KBA Community can help get you signed up to regular newsletters about what's happening. Also links to webinars that we're putting out. And that's my contact email at the bottom there, should you want to contact me about any specific language. So thank you for listening to each of these presentations. I'll stop sharing there and then allow time for questions. Does anyone have specific questions that they would like to ask? And if so, please unmute yourself and ask them.
Okay, Andy, this is Lindsay speaking. From the chat, we do have a question from Emon regarding how countries can join the KBA network. So I think that could be a question for Dan to respond to, or yourself.
Daniel, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure, thanks. And just to ask everyone, if you've got a question, just to raise your hands and we'll monitor them and work through the raised hands. But I've put a link in the chat box for joining the KBA community. So that's one way to join the initiative, is to become a member of the community, receive the newsletters. We try and hold regular webinars, and we really facilitate the link to the KBA committee. But in terms of starting national processes, the best way is really to start on the road of setting up a national coordination group, which is a multi-stakeholder group consisting normally of government representatives, NGO representatives, experts on certain taxa, area-based conservationists or planners. It's really up to you who you want to include on the national coordination group. And that's the body that then starts the process at a national level. And the KBA Secretariat, as well as the community or your regional reps, can assist you in setting up the national coordination group. I see we've got a raised hand from Andrew Skoner in South Africa. Andrew, go for it.
Hi, everyone. You should also just have a look in the chat, James's question as well. Don't forget about that. I've got a couple of points. I think the suggestion around linking target 13 and target 1 is a very good idea. I like that. I missed that. I think I don't read things as carefully when I get to the lower number, the high numbered targets. So I think that's a really good point, and that's something that I'll certainly suggest to I'm not a focal point, but I do some advice to our focal point in the department. So I think that's a great idea. Andy, I wanted to ask you about, just want to just check which one it was. Okay. So in target 2, the language changed over the last few years, or like a year and a half. And it started with like 30%, hopefully representatively of, so that you could represent ecosystems, so you weren't just getting 30% of the easiest parts of the landscape to get. But there was language earlier on around, and then 60% of areas of specific or particular biodiversity importance. So that was sort of March last year. And I'm not sure why, but I see that language has evaporated. And I'm quite interested because we would want a much higher target for protection, because KBAs don't always have to be protected. But for their protection, you would expect a far higher proportion than your general landscape, right? Because these are the areas with the highest bang for your buck. So quite interesting, what do you think about the where did that language go around the 60%? We certainly didn't vote to remove it, and just wanted to get your feedback on that. And then how do you feel about with the spatial planning issue? One thing that would concern me a little is that KBAs, if they are put right up front in a target, they can be quite inefficient as a spatial planning tool. So they don't have the representativity and well, you can work in the representativity, but they don't have the efficiency of a systematic conservation planning approach. So that would be one little worry. And then overall, just some feedback from our discussions in South Africa was everyone is very comfortable with KBAs as indicators, even headline indicators. But there was some pushback from various people in the discussions to have the KBA kind of hardwired into the target. So, I can't even remember exactly why. I'll have to go back to my notes, but just it might be a common theme around the world where people are very comfortable with it at the indicator level, but there's some resistance that they're trying to get the language too strongly into the actual targets. I don't know if you've encountered that before.
You're on mute, Andy.
I'm muted. I'll take the spatial planning question. Maybe Amy or Noel, would you be willing to take the history of the language of target 2? Because you would probably know that better than I do. So on the spatial planning, what we would argue is that KBAs should be factored into spatial planning and thought about, because these overarching criteria try to capture very many different types of conservation target that people are aiming to conserve. So it's not just looking at threatened biodiversity or threatened ecosystems, but it's looking at geographically restricted species as well as sites of ecological integrity and irreplaceable sites. So we wouldn't necessarily say that every single KBA has to be part of a spatial plan, but we would argue that people should be considering them as part of their spatial planning. And in that motion that I mentioned, we also think about connectivity as well as intact areas as part of that spatial planning. So it's not just KBAs that we would be promoting as part of the spatial planning. Amy, do you want to take the stuff about the language?
Hi, I'm hoping that Noelle might be able to step in, as she's been following these more closely than I have, and the specific changes of language over time. Although I think it would be good if you could just slightly clarify, Andrew, exactly what you were referring to under target 2. Thanks.
I mean, I'll have to try and dig it up, but in the original language in preparation for Kunming, when it was still going to happen before the pandemic, the language in target 2, I'm pretty certain, had this like 2-tier approach around protection, the kind of 30% general, but then there was a 60% for areas of particular biodiversity importance. Anyway, I mean, it might be like the horse has bolted and that's kind of long gone. So it might be just a moot point. So I was quite interested in that, because I thought that was quite a useful way to deal with it. We want a representative protected area network around the world. We don't, but you can also then accommodate those areas of particularly high biodiversity in particular through aiming for a higher target in those areas. So, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on it. It might be kind of a pointless discussion at this point.
Yeah, no, I can jump in here. So I'm just trying to think back. I picked up that you said 60%. You meant 60% of the 30%, right? So there was a discussion, and we and others kind of had a lot of discussions about this in terms of having a strict protection element, if that's what you mean. So within this 30%, so for example, the EU, and I think there are certain regions of the world where this is quite relevant, and it links to effective protection, effective conservation. So there's a concern, and groups like the World Heritage Secretariat were also keen to ensure that there was a proportion of these, of the 30% was strictly protected, and that it wasn't, and that was a key element. The way this is wording. Oh, sorry, what?
Sorry, Amy's just posted the text from the zero draft in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Perfect. Well done. Yeah, covering at least 60% of the site. Sorry, and I'm mixing up the strict protection element. Yeah. I mean, I think we would be aiming for 100% of those sites. I mean, those sites are also too, many of them need to be assessed, but I think limiting it to 60% is potentially an issue. So we really want the focus of Target 2 to be upfront and central on the biodiversity elements. So key biodiversity areas. I also wanted to address your point on the kind of where should key KBAs go and key biodiversity areas in the target versus the indicator. And I think we would sort of recommend small letters key biodiversity areas. So, and also recognise that's not the only area of importance for national governments, but as the global standard, as your first point of call, KBAs, key biodiversity areas, and then other areas of importance for biodiversity. And that really should be the focus of Target 2. With things like ecosystem services really is kind of, there are other places where ecosystem services are focused on more, and we certainly shouldn't be reducing the proportion of important areas for biodiversity that are protected under Target 2 with ecosystem services areas. So I think we're quite keen to maintain that focus, the priority on key biodiversity areas and other areas of importance for biodiversity, and really make that point clearly. And 60%, so we're really wanting to get to 100% of KBAs covered by 2050. So we have, in terms of the indicators, we've got a paper we can share with you showing tracking the indicators from the 2025 milestone to 2020 to 2030, 2040, 2050. And so where we are now in terms of proportion of sort of protected area and OECM coverage of KBAs, and where we want to be by 2050. So to meet the goal, the 2050 vision and the goals, outcome goals at that point. So yeah, we want to be aiming for 100% coverage at that point, not just 60%.
And just to be clear, that's 100% coverage of protected areas or OECMs. We're not saying that every KBA needs to be a protected area.
Yeah.
And then this from Kiribati. Apologies, because I might have one of the few who joined the wrong online webinar link. But thank you for the presentation. I just catch the last part of the presentation of the last presenter. I just want to express that from Kiribati, we have also completed the KBA study, and that we are working now to utilizing the KBA reports to help inform our chief national project interventions. Currently, we've been utilizing the KBA reports to inform the chief project sites for CHIF 5, and then recently now also for CHIF 7. We're currently working with Iucn Oceania office to help us complete our brief submission to the CHIF Secretariat for the June Council meeting. But we were hoping that if that's approved, it will also be furthering the KBA implementation. We're currently looking at doing our NBSEP review. I think we only have the 5th NBSEP report, but we are currently looking for funding and technical support to secure from the CBD. And I take note of the suggestions made in the last slide. where one of the actions we can do at the country level is leveraging the KBA importance in the NBSAP 6 national reports. We would be very much interested to hear more guidance, but I thank you also for advising that the webinar is reported. We'll definitely go through that with our team from here in Kiribati. And if we have questions, we'll come back to Lindsay or the KBA Secretariat. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. That's encouraging that you've been working on KBA identifications, and certainly get in touch. We'll help you also with KBA proposal process as you start that. And it would be good to think about setting up a KBA national coordination group for your country, so we can discuss about how you might do that as well. So please do get in touch. I'll put my email in the chat as well, so that everyone has that.
Andy, one question from Golo is how many of the MBSAPs reviewed were completed after 2016? For instance, Australia's last one was in 2014. Do you know that?
Yeah, so the graph that I put up, I was showing basically results of the MBSAP 4th reports, 5th reports, and 6th reports under the dates, and the average date for 4th report was 2011. I think for the 5th report was about 2014-15. For the 6th report was 2019-20. So those were how I looked at the different dates. So yes, Australia is behind. And Australia is interesting because Australia has a huge amount of expertise in spatial planning, but their MBSAP had very little to do, few maps and few talk any language about spatial planning. So there's clearly a big disconnect between all the experts that you have who are doing this, particularly developing things like Mark's C plan, and the government and what they're actually reporting.
Sorry, are you hearing me clearly now?
That's better, yes, thanks.
Okay, my apologies. Thanks for the technical coaching here. So I was saying, my name is actually Daniel Lebon. I've taken over from Mr. Augustine, so you'd see that name flagged. But this is, yeah, I'm actually the manager at the Piton Management Area World Heritage Site in St. Lucia. So I am catching up. I'm not a veteran like some of you guys. And my understanding is that there are certain commitments made by the state party, the national government. And so I would need to brief myself on this. I was invited to the webinar, which I appreciate. But for me as a manager struggling with a small World Heritage Site, 2,909 hectares, some of you might be aware of the Pitons. Is a famous international landmark, the Twin Peaks in St. Lucia. It's in the Caribbean. We were inscribed in 2005, 30th of June to be precise, by UNESCO. For me, the key concern is because a lot of this technical stuff is above the heads of us as small developing countries. And sorry, I just had to dismiss a call here. My apologies. And I think what is really required here is a bit of holding hands and guiding us in terms of how we participate more actively in a more relevant way in this process, and how do we secure, available benefits. And I think that's critical, because sometimes we tend to underestimate the limitations in terms of the capacity of small island developing states. So I might be very vague and general here in my comments, but I'm expressing a real need and concern. So I just present this now and wait to hear from the rest of you guys. Thanks.
Yeah. mean, I realize it's difficult for many small states. The one thing I would say is that at the moment, because everything is being done virtually on Zoom and other platforms, it is actually much easier to engage now than it has been in the past, where you would have had to find funds to send people to a meeting and all the hotel bills and everything else that go with that. So where you've got, you're basically needing to work with your government representatives. And I wasn't sure if when you said you'd taken over from Augustine, is that as a government position?
It is a government position. It's under the Ministry of the Department of Sustainable Development. Yeah.
Okay. So you will definitely have the ability to attend CBD meetings and put your points of view across and statements. Amy is very much involved in this, and I also see Noel is on the call as well. Do you want to comment on how Augustine would, Daniel, do that?
Yes, thanks, Andy. And as Andy says, yeah, there are a huge number of opportunities to engage in the process, and a huge number of observers that would also be willing to support you in bringing you up to speed on the different CBD processes, if that's something that you would be interested in, and would also, look forward to speaking with you and other members of the NFP about the various different positions and how those have been adapted and revised over time. But specifically, as Andy says, at the moment, because a lot of the CBD process has gone online and has become virtual, that means that there is an opportunity to kind of listen into the negotiations and to get a real sense of how the different parties are positioning on different elements. And of course, you'll have heard of the High Ambition Coalition, which is pushing the 30 by 30 ask under the conserved area target, which you might be interested in looking at. And there's also the Leaders Pledge for Nature, which are spaces in which parties are working together to drive ambition for biodiversity. So there's lots and lots and lots of activity ongoing. And of course, if you, I'm sure you have other friendly parties that you're engaging with. But if you do want any advice or contacts or links, please do get in touch. I'll drop my email in the list as well, and signpost you to some of the positions that have been developed in the NGO community.
Lindsay, I see you've got a hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. It's just to ask the presenters for the benefits of our participants who unfortunately joined the earlier webinar rather than this one, if we could perhaps give from the three presenters your key issues and key points that you'd like to get across for their benefit, seeing as they've missed quite a bit, if that could help perhaps.
Okay, Amy, do you want to go first?
Okay, Andy, I'll give it a shot. So thanks, Lindsay. So really just to re-emphasize that this is a really live process, that there are lots of opportunities to engage over the coming months as we move towards the Conference of the Parties later in the year, and for observers and parties alike, lots of different processes which you can become involved in to try and support and shape the Global Biodiversity Framework as it moves forwards to its agreement in October at COP15. So really just to emphasize that this is a really important moment for biodiversity. It's a year in which we have the culmination of 3 different COP processes at the Convention on Biological Diversity, within the UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change, and within the UNCCD, which is the Convention on Desertification, and a real opportunity to kind of highlight those joint agendas and really push for transformational change. So what I'm trying to say is that it's time to get excited about what we can achieve as a community, and there are huge numbers of opportunities to get involved and really help to shape that process through the negotiations and otherwise. I'll stop there.
Daniel, do you want to give a summary?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that I think we now have a global standard that can be used to identify the most important places for biodiversity across taxa, across ecosystems. And so we've got this really valuable global currency that we can use to prioritize where we invest in a landscape, and it can obviously be used as indicators for various targets, as Andy pointed out. But I think in terms of area-based conservation, key biodiversity areas are going to prove really useful for prioritizing where we invest, but also monitoring the effectiveness of our area-based approaches to conserve biodiversity. So it's just a really useful tool. It's not the only tool, there are a lot of others, but I think in terms of capturing all taxa and all ecosystems at globally applicable, KBAs are really useful. Thank you.
And then finally, on the presentation that I made, some of you caught the end of it, but what we're trying to do is engage with different governments to work together as a group to promote KBA language. So we've specifically selected your countries because we know you have an interest in key biodiversity areas. You've got specific targets in your NBSAPs around key biodiversity areas. We feel as a group, we will be stronger at lobbying that KBA language gets into the post-2020 agenda. And that will, of course, then lead to further funding and ability to support conservation of key biodiversity areas down the line. So what I'd encourage you to do is please get in touch. We will circulate the PowerPoint from today and also give the links to the recordings. And then my email's in the PowerPoint, so is Daniel's, and Amy's just given her email in the chat. So please do get in touch if you've got interests, and we can try and work with you and bring you together as a team.
I've just spotted in the chat that Yasser Belmar has a question. Yasser, would you like to come in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, hi everyone, Yasser Belmar from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I just had a question. So you mentioned that you wanted us to help to lobby for KBA language in the convention process. Do you know if there is any opposition to this, or what are some of the drawbacks to using this approach?
So there are some countries that have developed their own prioritization. It's usually countries where they've already done spatial planning. But what we're finding is that where countries that have done that spatial planning then also look at doing a KBA assessment, so South Africa in particular is a good example of that. It's actually helped them identify additional areas that they'd missed in their original spatial planning. So although there's been some resistance because there's governments that have already done their own spatial planning and come up with their own systems, we still see a value in going through the process of identifying key biodiversity areas. So, but there's no very strong opposition. It's just that some countries don't want it to be just KBAs. So what the language that we promote in any of the post-2020 agenda stuff is the focus should be on key biodiversity areas and other sites of importance for biodiversity. So it allows that. But given that the key biodiversity area standard was developed through extensive consultation across the conservation community and with governments over about a 4-year process, it's got a lot of buy-in as a way of identifying sites of global importance.
Okay, just a follow-up question. How much more effort would it take in terms of capacity and resources to do this type of spatial planning? Because this is an area I know that we haven't done a lot of work in, and it's to some extent due to those capacity constraints.
Yeah, so a lot will depend on how your biodiversity information that does exist is held. Some countries have a biodiversity database, and it's very easy if you have all the data in one place. So for instance, South Africa had data on thousands of species. I think they did an assessment with something like 25,000 species that they had data on. Other countries, it's very spread about, and Mozambique, for instance, had to first work with experts from outside the country and inside the country to compile the data, and it was basically a 2-year process to identify their key biodiversity areas.
I see Hugo has his hand up, so you maybe want to share.
Yeah, do you want to add to that, Hugo? Because he was involved in the Mozambique process.
Yes, sorry. Just to state exactly that, just to reinforce what you have just said. So, when we started 2 years ago with this process, it seemed almost like an impossible task. I trusted on Andy as we use this experience to plan this project. And 2 years have gone, and we were finally able to have 29 KBAs approved, both in the marine and terrestrial realms, which it's amazing. And we started with compared to South Africa, the level of information that Mozambique has is much lower, but still it's possible. So what this methodology shows is that independently on your country having a lot of biodiversity information or only a few, you can identify KBAs. So the type of approach, so use the same standards, use the same technical guidelines, the same criteria, but the way how you run the process is different, of course. But you can get to the final result as well, and we are a proof of that. So we wouldn't think that it would be possible after 2 years. The establishment of the National Coordination Group is essential to that. Okay, and that makes a difference. And then with the good coordination and using the resources you have available, you can run this. And the advantage is that the KBA concept is also quite easy to explain to the government, conversely to other type of approaches. Okay, so the government knew nothing about KBAs at the beginning, and now they are advocating for the KBAs. I saw that in the past meeting this morning. We had 6 people from Mozambique attending the meeting out of 20 something. So 2 of them were from the government, 1 from a university, the other from NGO. So this shows how well it has been embedded into the country. And we were able to include this. So for example, the National Territorial Development Plan, and now in the Marine Spatial Plan. So I think it's a good way, especially for countries that do not have all this amount of information like South Africa has. It's a good approach to start with some sort of spatial planning in terms of integrating biodiversity into spatial planning. Thank you.
Does that help you, Yasser? Or do you want more details?
No, that is good. I just have one additional question. He mentioned that there is I think there is a methodology or something. Are there resources that have already been developed to guide countries in how to do this?
Yes, there are. If you look on the KBA website, which is www.keybiodiversityareas.org, there's materials there, but there's also a set of training materials, and we can help give some online training, which would, if you set up a national coordination group, we could work together and basically plan some training. So we've been doing that recently with Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Ivory Coast. So yes, please get in touch and we can help in any way. There's also proposal forms that help guide you through the types of information that you need to collect. And I can help go through those with you as well. So if you want to move ahead, please get in touch. We're willing to help you.
And just to let you know also that we are about to publish the reports from our project. There are 4 main volumes, and then a set of complementary documents which describe the whole process that we run in Mozambique. So I think that could be used also as a guidance, especially for countries that are just starting this type of approach. Thanks.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If not, please make sure that Lindsay has your contact details, and we'll circulate PDFs of the PowerPoints that were presented, particularly for those who missed the beginning. Sorry about that. And we'll also give you the links when the recording's uploaded, so that you can have access to the actual speakers as well.